Newcastle are at that stage at the moment that if they are to lose Isak, why wouldn't you look at Mateta? He's one of the names that's not really being mentioned, but I'm thinking you've got wingers who put balls into the box.
I'd have Mateta over Jackson. I don't know what you two think, but I would have Mateta over Jackson.
Hello, Mark.
Hi, Gabby. You all right?
Yes. Are you well busy at the weekend?
Yeah, fairly quiet one. I don't know if you feel the same, but thank that's over.
It is a relief to stop talking about something and just do the thing, isn't it? And I thought that actually was reflected across the Premier League in terms of the players. You know, we talk and talk, don't we, about these new signings?
Yeah.
And what we'll do today is talk about how they all got on. Stephen Warnock's going to join us in a moment to look at some of the big storylines and tell us a bit about his new podcast as well. We come.
Do you know what though? Just at the weekend at 3:45 on that Saturday afternoon, Newcastle Villa had ended goalless at Villa Park. The Sunderland West Ham game was goalless. Brighton Fulham, I think, was goalless as well. And Tottenham were leading Burnley 1-0. I was thinking, bloody hell, this could be the worst match of the day ever.
The only person that would be happy about that was somebody who was sent to me on my algorithm on social media the other day. Is a guy who's promised to run the amount of goals per miles every week in the Premier League. And last year, 1,260, I think. So it'll average out about 28 to 30 miles a week he's going to have to run for every goal. So he would have been happy at that.
He would have been very happy.
So as a Manchester United supporter, were you kind of taking the positives from your
very
performance?
much. Yeah, absolutely. They actually put a smile on my face on Sunday. Now, and I know, I mean, there are so many things about that are remarkable. Oh no, just that one sentence has nearly made you fall off your hotel bed in shock. But I'm only slightly wary because at times they have done that in the past over the last, and a couple of seasons, and you think, oh, maybe there's a false dawn here or whatever. But I thought, and we'll talk about it a little bit later with Stephen Warnock, but I thought they looked athletic, they looked strong, they looked like they were, to use an old school term, that they were up for it. Now look, at the end of it, they haven't scored, right, and they've lost, but there were elements in virtually every single player there that I thought, okay, that looks different. That De Ligt looked commanding at the back. I thought Yoro had a good game. Shaw and Dorgu and Mason Mount was
he was
brilliant
great
for the hour that Mason Mount was on. So, but they did have the ability at times last season to raise their game for either a big match or a big opponent. And then they went to somebody or were at home to somebody that you could argue they should beat and then made a right rickets of it. So it's whether they
do that at Craven Cottage at the weekend.
Yeah, a little bit. Whether they carry that mantle of, right, we're arriving in town. It sounds arrogant, this, and lots of fans will hate this, but we're arriving in town. We're Manchester United, and we're going to play our game and try and dominate you, which is what a Liverpool or a Manchester City or an Arsenal would do. And that's what I would be sort of. That's where I'm just slightly wary until I see a few of those games of getting too carried away. I thought the other thing that stood out for me over the weekend, and look, the Leeds penalty was debatable at best, but I think the fact that both Leeds and Sunderland won and Burnley did have some chances when they were only 1-0 down does bode well for a competitive Premier League. Bearing in mind, 5th of October, Gabby, last season, was when a promoted side won their first game. So for two of them...
And early November before two of them.
Yes. So we're up and running with two of them, and I think that can only be a good thing.
Yeah, because Leeds go to Arsenal at the weekend, so that they're going to have a real test there, aren't they? But I have to say, I was watching this while I was in transit, the Leeds game, kind of in the airport, and then got the tail end when I landed, and the atmosphere at Elland Road, and it was reflected in the TV coverage actually, and they kind of mentioned the fact that it's so important for Leeds fans to be back in the Premier League, and they didn't just disappear from their seats within a few minutes. They stayed, they sang. It felt like a massive cup win, and And that is what, if you're a promoted side, you've got to make your home games feel like that, haven't you, to give yourself that advantage. And certainly Sunderland, that was reflected there as well in the Stadium of Light before Sunderland fans pile in and say, minute, because that was incredible, wasn't it? The atmosphere there as well. So it's great to have them all back, and hopefully they will kind of buck the trend of the last couple of seasons. If you didn't hear it, Chris Wilder was talking about this, explaining why it is harder than ever for promoted sides to survive the Premier League. You can catch up with that episode and all our episodes on YouTube, Global Player, or wherever you get your podcasts.
I just want to mention on the men's golf side of things, Scotty Scheffler won his 18th PGA Tour event at the BMW Championship. That's his 5th win this year. He chipped in on the 17th to all but seal the win.
Yeah, Tiger-esque, reminiscent of the 16th hole at the 2005 Masters tournament. Just pulled that one from my memory banks there, Chappers. To do what Tiger did, he'd have to be number one now for another 118 weeks. So he'd have to do it until Halloween 2028, which is not beyond the realms of possibility for him at the moment, the way he's playing.
He's just... he has an aura about him, despite having a very laid-back demeanour, despite looking like nothing's going to bother him at all. His game is just so ultra consistent, and watching him on that Sunday at Portrush as he won the Open was a privilege. Actually, it was. I know it was a procession and therefore didn't have the drama of, say, a McIlroy at the Masters, but it was a privilege to be able to watch him go around Portrush the way he did. He does everything for his family, for his parents, for his wife, for his son, and he just gets on with it. Look, he isn't necessarily gonna put bums on seats in the way that Tiger did, but you have to have nothing but admiration for a man who is at the absolute top of his game. And the other thing I think was, going into that final round, Bob McIntyre had a decent lead and kind of
a 4-shot lead.
Yeah, a 4-shot lead, and he fell away, and he was getting more and more annoyed with himself. And I think part of that was, obviously, he was annoyed with his own game. He seemed to be hitting the ball further than he thought he should be hitting it. But it's the presence of Scheffler. Once Scheffler is there and within touching distance, that has to have an effect on the
It happens in so many other sports, doesn't it? That the true greatness you see, in that golden era in tennis, where you had Federer and Gyökeres and Nadal all playing. Whoever they played against, no matter how well they've been playing, it's that somebody that can get over the line and win. It counts for so much. And obviously Bob McIntyre's quote as well, I think will go down as one of my favourite of the week, if not the month, of right now, I want to go smash up my golf clubs, to be honest with you, because I think any of us who played the game know exactly how that feels. And may well have smashed up some golf clubs.
100%. One final thing, Women's Rugby Union World Cup. Are you ready?
Yeah. I'm very excited. Do you know why? I know you're not a big social media person, Mark, but the social media for the teams arriving this week has been off the charts with joy. So they're all staying in various cities, the countries that are playing in the World Cup. And I saw the Americans arriving who are playing England on Friday at Stadium of Light, and being received there was just glorious, walking around York, Minster. And everywhere they go, they're dancing. And there's been a kind of certain attitude within rugby. Hang on a minute. You're putting your heads above the parapet. You're all excited. There was a bit of a backlash during the Six Nations when Sarah Burns, her TikTok kind of profile, she was TikToking in the crowd. They love it. They're playing, they play this a really tough sport. They go out there as warrior women, but then they have a great time when they're not on the pitch. And I think that is really going to resonate with people. I was reading some incredible stats yesterday. World Rugby sees women's rugby as a massive opportunity because the men's game is not attracting at the same rate new fans that it needs to survive. The women's game is attracting so many new fans, and almost could be the thing that actually keeps the men's game, kind of front and center, because those fans might cross over to the men's game, which is not something. It's very different, I think, to the kind of journey of women's football in a way, and rugby recognises that. So as you can tell, I'm excited about it. It'll be very different to the Euros, and it probably won't catch fire with the public until England are in a quarter-final, maybe. But it'll be well worth watching, and I think you'll enjoy it if you make the effort.
Just on the men's
Not
side.
you. I know you.
No, I will make the effort. Yeah, you lazy ass. Just make an effort, will you? Watch what I'm doing. All right, I will. Just on the men's side of things, just a little note. Australia beat South Africa in Johannesburg over the weekend in the Rugby Championship. It's their first win at Ellis Park for 60 plus years. I mean,
and South Africa were absolutely cruising in the first. It was an incredible turnaround. They'd play again this weekend, so let's see what South Africa have got. But I love Rassie Erasmus, the South African coach's quote. Can I swear on the podcast? I think you did earlier. Yeah. He said we were absolute dog, which I would like more managers to use that language on Match of the Day this season.
Keep your questions coming in or complaints about the language on this podcast. Email the sportsagents@global.com or on our socials, or use the new fancy Google form in the episode description.
But back to the opening weekend then. So was that from Tijjani Reijnders the best Premier League debut that you can remember? Well, the noise around his move to Man City was certainly not up there with some big names, was it? Maybe one of the quietest. We're going to get into that story and behind what is being described as one of the best Premier League debuts next. Welcome, Andy Brassell, host of the brilliant European football podcast On the Continent. So of all the people that I'm going to speak to over the last week and the next week, I am sure that the performance of Tijjani Reijnders was not one that surprised you.
Not massively. I mean, I guess the thing is, Gabby, you've always got to give someone a bit of latitude when they're arriving in the Premier League because, of course, the pace, the tempo, all of that's way different. Although I do tend to think that over time that becomes a little less because the Premier League is so incredibly influential in world circles. Everyone watches it everywhere. I mean, I've just been on holiday to Tanzania and I saw someone coming out of walking through a village wearing a Brighton and Hove Albion shirt. That's how big the Premier League is worldwide now. And I kind of feel it's had a knock-on effect about the way the game is played as well. If you look at Serie A, we think of it as a finishing school for defenders and all that sort of stuff. It's like chess. It's not really like football. Well, you know what? If you look at the way the average goals have gone in Serie A over the last 10 years, you'll know it's influenced by the Premier League, even though there's, I guess, less interchange in terms of big players going over there. Funnily enough, what we're seeing more is players who are struggling in the Premier League going over to Serie A to sort of revive their careers, and not just English players. We've seen Romelu Lukaku, Ashley Young, etc., etc., etc. But the thing with Reijnders is he obviously comes from a different sort of background. Now, he's an academy kid to a certain extent, because he started out at defence. They got rid of him pretty quickly when he was a teenager. Everyone knows the story about him. He was working in Aldi while still trying to make it as a footballer. And he didn't actually make his top flight debut until he was 21 on loan at RKC Waalwijk, after he hadn't made it with his hometown club, PEC Zwolle, who are hardly one of the most famous names in the Netherlands. But I remember speaking to Frank de Boer when he was in charge at Ajax, and speaking to Brian Roy when he was working with the Ajax second team there. And for like 15 years now, people in Dutch football have said, okay, well, we've got an image of playing football in a certain way worldwide. You think of Cruyff, you think of pass, and everything that made Barcelona what they are today. But actually, they're quite open, and they have been for the last 10, 15 years, about the dynamics of European football have changed, the financial dynamics of European football have changed. So it's not just a question of cultural influence. They need to produce players who are going to be good for the Premier League. And that means producing harder, faster, stronger players. And what I saw with Reijnders, who, as you say, to an extent, it wasn't a surprise, Gabby, because he was a player who was one of the very best in Serie A last season. He was fantastic for Milan. He was their best player by some distance. But it's something that City really missed last season. And I think that sort of physical power that he showed and his ability to adapt to the tempo of the game is something you maybe don't get from a Dutch player 15 years ago.
So I find that point really interesting. And I suppose it's only natural, and what would happen in any other business is what is the market going to want, both now and in 5 years' time? That's what every business tries to do. So is that unique to the Ajax Academy or Dutch academies, or are you seeing that more across other European markets? Right. What can we do with our kids that gets them into our first team, but then makes them a viable proposition to be sold to the behemoth that is the Premier League?
I think for those mid-leagues, those mid-level leagues, it's absolutely integral, Chappers. The ones that are below the top five. So we think of like Dutch football imposing its culture on other countries, and I don't really think that's the case anymore. I mean, the phrase that Frank de Boer used to me is, "We need to breed them for market," which I think is,
wow,
just realistic, isn't it? Really,
yeah.
But I think
makes him sound like Clarkson on his farm. That's what that's what that does.
That's probably why he's not involved at the moment.
If you were ever under any doubt at all that they are commodities, that is extraordinary, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But when you're talking about other countries from that below top 5 level, it's absolutely a consideration. And I think if you look at actually another Milan coach, Sergio Conceição, who was there last season, who won the Super Cup for them and was in charge of Reijnders for a lot of last season, he's been criticised quite a lot in Portugal for when he was in charge of Porto, when they didn't really have much money, when they were under heavy FFP manners, that he sort of morphed the way they play, because Porto are used to winning Champions Leagues, producing great footballers, all that sort of stuff. And Conceição was like, right, I want to make us more physical. I want us to be able to not just breed players for market, but actually be able to compete with teams in the Champions League, be it English or French or Spanish clubs, by just having a bit more oomph to our game. And, he was incredibly successful in Porto, Conceição, for someone who didn't really have a huge transfer budget, who didn't have the best set of players in the history of the club. There were no Paulo Futres in his team. But there was a sense of, we're going to be more practical. We're going to be able to physically compete with these sort of players. And I think it's interesting that now, we always talk about there being a big leap to the Premier League. Well, actually, because these clubs are saying we really need, it's an imperative to go get that money. We don't want to sell to Spanish clubs. They haven't got any money. Let's sell to Premier League clubs. So let's create players who are, and Conceição was criticised for it by some traditional Porto fans. We don't want players who are 6'2" who clatter other players. We want little wizards. Well, you know what? That's not what sells. So maybe we have to create something else.
And so seeing where those trends go, interesting, related but not directly, talking about goalkeeping at the weekend to Joe Hart, and he was saying, like, what perhaps Pep is looking at now is not necessarily always somebody who can play out from the back, and it potentially could play left back if they had to. Actually, it's perhaps those players whose directional kicking is very, very important. I mean, getting over the back and over the top is actually better, or is more important for him at the moment. So he was quite convinced that Pep might have changed his mind about that, and that there's a new way of playing coming yet again.
Sorry, I was going to say Reijnders would then fit into that, presumably, Gabby, from what Joe was saying, because there was a man who carried the ball, and we had the discussion on Saturday about players who've carried the ball for Manchester City in recent years have kind of been moved. Jack Grealish
moved on to Everton.
Moved on to Everton, yeah. So maybe it is changing, Andy.
Yeah, I think so, and I guess that sort of running through onto longer passes is where Reijnders comes in. And funnily enough, I know people have said again and again and again, you can't replace Kevin De Bruyne. And it seems like heresy to say you can replace Kevin De Bruyne, but you can replace him with a different player. And maybe that is Reijnders. And funnily enough, something that Reijnders and KDB, when he originally arrived from Wolfsburg, have got in common is they're midfield players who aim to get beyond the striker. So what made De Bruyne so immediately successful when he arrived in the Premier League was the fact that he was a playmaker with pace as well. So not just someone who scratched his chin and, had a little bit of a think about where he was going to play the right pass, but someone who grabbed the game by the scruff of the neck, not just because he had such a range of passing, but because he could actually get beyond the last defender and get beyond the last striker if he wanted to, because he had that kind of pace. And because he'd been encouraged to do that in the Bundesliga, talking about, the cross-cultural things that we share between the leagues now, which I think we do a lot. I think that's really important. But funnily enough, when you're going back and talking about goalkeepers and ones that have not just the ability on the ball to get themselves out of tight spots, but the range of passing, Gabby, I think of what goalkeeper can do that better than any other. It's Ederson. I remember interviewing Ederson a while back, and normally when you ask viewer questions or listener questions to a player, they have a bit of a think about it. They're caught on the hop. And someone had asked me to ask him, what position would you play if you were an outfield player? Edison didn't even let me get to the end of the question. He's like, left back. I'll be Roberto Carlos. That would be me, So he's someone who's got it completely in his mind. He doesn't really see himself as just a goalkeeper. He's like, I'm a football player. It goes against the Ruud Gullit thing of, if you were any good at football, you wouldn't be in goal. Yeah. And funnily enough, I guess we're seeing another Brazilian player who I think is going to make a massive impact in the Premier League, Lucas Perry, who could end up going as third choice for Brazil to the World Cup. I mean, there's a lot of good Brazilian goalkeepers at the moment, but you think he's not just got that massive frame that we like in Premier League goalkeepers, brave enough to come off his line and get the ball and, not physically intimidated by strikers, but he's someone who is not averse to a long pass as well. So that could catch a few Leeds opponents on the hop and lean into what you were saying, Gabby.
Yeah.
Tottenham did it as well. Tottenham did the more direct long pass as well to break through Burnley's, which was really refreshing, I thought. The other thing with Reijnders is he's 27, and therefore he is experienced. He's got a decent back catalogue behind him. Are you sensing that is there a change in what Premier League, the big Premier League clubs want in terms of age profile that they're going through? Are they going for less untapped rough diamonds and more established at the moment? Is there a trend, or is there not?
I think Reijnders is a bit of a one-off in that sense, really, Chappers. And look at his passport, he's 27. But if you look at his career path, he's a bit of a late developer. He's almost like an Ian Wright, really. Not quite to that extent, but in the sense that, we expect players to be, a lot of the players that we sort of see every day in the Premier League, we've known that they could be something since they were 16, 17, even if it's taken them a little while to break through. And if you look at the market, how long it took Arsenal to get the Gyökeres deal together, the fact that there was not a Premier League landing spot for Victor Osimhen, two of the strikers that if you go back, I think even 3 years, they wouldn't be on the market for 10 seconds. They would get snapped up by one of the Premier League big boys straight away. But there was clearly a lot of internal discussion at Arsenal. Do we go with Šeško, the young guy with big upside, or do we go with Gyökeres, who's been a bit more around the block, a little bit like Reijnders, and is the guarantee of goals now? So I still think, and it still feels to me that in the age of PSR and FFP, that even the biggest clubs, and Chelsea have been criticised for this, but unfairly to an extent, I would say, they still want to invest in guys who they can sell on in the future, who might develop into something. It's almost as if people would rather have a John Duran than a Victor Gyökeres these days, which is kind of wild to me, because Duran's upside is enormous, but you don't really know what he's going to turn into. And that's why he was scoring goals in the Champions League 10 months ago to beat Bayern Munich, and now he's 2 clubs down the line and playing at Fenerbahce, which is totally weird, because they can match the sort of wages that are in the Middle East. So look, I do think Reijnders is a bit of an unusual one. You look at him at 27 and you think that is not something that Premier League clubs go and get. But maybe they're looking at him and thinking, well, because he's kind of a late developer, he's got a little bit more in the tank. So it's not really like buying a 27-year-old. He's had 2 really good seasons and 1 exceptional season at Milan. But really, because of his career path, it's almost like you're buying a 24-year-old rather than a 27-year-old.
But also, I would imagine if you're buying him for 45 million and he's 27 and you get 5 years out of him, I mean, you're not you're not going to really be that bothered whether there's resale value, are you? In that sense, I wouldn't have thought.
No, I guess it's less important to Manchester City than it would be to like a Villa or a Chelsea, teams that have real PSR issues, I suppose, and have had in recent years. But still, I think it's sort of slightly comforting to like for me. If you look at Reijnders, he's been playing for a top level team, if you can still call Milan that, or at least a big name top level club for a couple of years now. He only made his Dutch debut 2 months after arriving there. So, and again, if we're looking at the changing face of football, he's not a typical Netherlands player, but he is going to be absolutely key for them going forward into the World Cup.
And that, again, you talk about miles on the clock and actually kind of adjusting that with his age. If you're not playing international football in all your breaks through those 4 or 5 seasons, you're getting proper kind of downtime at the end of a season and your body's recovering, isn't it? So in terms of his body and how that's, is going to be able to handle life in the Premier League, that's also interesting. And also I heard comments at the weekend about him as a person. And there was very complimentary comments about the kind of person he is. And a lot of pundits talking about how managers, yes, they love their data and their biometrics and all of that. But actually, as a person, what that kind of journey does to you and how hungry it makes you is something you can't quantify.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that's something that recruitment departments and coaches are looking at more and more and more. I think you can tell that he's done a proper job and is kind of a normal guy. I think you can definitely tell that about him. The way that he talks in such like glowing terms about
his post-match interviews were brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think when he's talking about his Indonesian heritage and he's talking about his love for nasi goreng, I saw an interviewer ask him, "Can you still eat nasi goreng now he's in the Premier League?" And he's like, "Come on, I've still got to be a normal guy, even if I'm a Premier League footballer, and I can't ditch that bit of the culture." But look, I think that's so important to tap into that, because I think sometimes, obviously, you get players who, in every country, who put in so much from when they're children. They do more than any children should be expected to do, really, to get to that point. But it's not always advantageous in terms of their personal development. And I think sometimes to have someone, and again, like a Gyökeres who has been around the block, has struggled to score goals at, say, Brighton or St. Pauli, had to come up through Coventry, and it's still remarkable to a lot of people I know who watch the Championship that no one was interested in Gyökeres, or no one was prepared to go the full way for him when he was leaving Coventry and when Ruben Amorim was prepared to go the full way for him. But one of the phrases I hear, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this on the podcast, so feel free to bleep it out.
Whatever it is. Anybody can say anything.
Okay, great. The phrase that I hear again and again and again, which is quite a modern football cliche, is that you hear managers and coaches say, "We've got a no dickheads policy in our dressing room." And I think that's really, really important. That shows you how much you have to be a personal fit as much as you need to be a technical and tactical fit.
Yeah, especially as, again, I think this is something that's going to come up more and more through the season, the importance of the finishers and how you keep finishers happy. Finishers, subs, whatever you want to call them, coming on earlier, keeping those players really happy, because they could be the ones that win the game for you. But maybe that's a discussion for another time. And I promise there'll be more swearing on the podcast later. Don't tell me how I know, but it's coming. Don't worry about it.
Has been quite a potty mouth podcast, this one. Andy, thank you very much. We will see you soon. We'll talk a little bit more about the expectations on new signings after the break with Stephen Warnock. Stephen Warnock joins us on the Sports Agents. What did you make of Reijnders' debut?
Very impressive. I think the big thing is, I know he's a quality player anyway, having watched him in the Champions League last year. I think he's an exceptional player. And you don't sign for Man City without having that quality. But to be able to adapt to the Premier League so quickly is impressive. However, I think we spoke on the build-up to the game. Wolves could be in a little bit of difficulty this year, so maybe not to read too much into it.
It's interesting, though, isn't it, that so many of the big names that we were looking out for at the weekend didn't grab the headlines, actually. And it just shows you how hard the Premier League is to adapt to, but also adapting to teams and managers having, a short period of time, relatively, certainly. You look at something like Chelsea, obviously, who've only had a week and a half off while a lot of their signings were involved in the Club World Cup. It's going to take time for some of those big names to settle.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I was at Anfield on Friday night, and there was a lot of talk about Wirtz and what was he going to do and how was he going to cope. And what you quickly realised was that the rigours of the Premier League, the physicality of it, is so much quicker than the Bundesliga. And this is the guy who's been the headline maker of the summer, apart from obviously Isak, but he's the one who's over the line with that big money signing. And you're looking at him thinking, can he adapt? How's he going to adapt? I think we know he will, but how long will it actually take?
But on that as well, then you throw somebody like Crystal Palace into this, who arguably ought to have beaten Chelsea on Sunday, and they're very. I know there are vultures circling around a couple of their players, but they're very stable. So they, as a group, haven't really got anything to get used to. They could get off to a fast start unless their squad gets decimated over the next week.
Well, that was exactly what I was just about to say. It's great for now, but we still got a couple of weeks left of the transfer window, and you could lose Gahey, they could lose Eza, Mateta. You just don't know what's going to happen, where a bid's going to come from. I mean, Newcastle are at that stage at the moment that if they are to lose Isak, why wouldn't you look at Mateta? He's one of the names that's not really being mentioned, but I'm thinking, you've got wingers who put balls into the box.
I'd have Mateta over Jackson. I don't know what you two think, but I would have Mateta over Jackson, who's been...
As a Newcastle fan, I would, yeah. Definitely.
100%. Yeah, I totally agree.
Danny Murphy was arguing, well, let me say arguing, just discussing, but it always
with
sounds
himself.
like an argument, doesn't it? But, he was telling me that I should be grateful as a Newcastle fan if I can get Nicholas Jackson, but I just don't think he's done enough to get that excited about. He's been so inconsistent that it doesn't.
I think the big thing with Mateta, his goals record is decent, and he's performed well, and he links up well. Whereas Jackson he's hugely frustrating, isn't he? The amount of times he gets caught offside, but also, does he warrant a £70 million transfer? Probably not.
I feel sorry for Nicholas Jackson here, Gabby, and you tell me how you think Newcastle fans would react, because I'm just going on how I think most fans would react. So if he comes in as a replacement for Isak, who goes, so he's replacing the third best goal scorer in the Premier League if you put Haaland and Salah to one side. He's replacing a player who has been absolutely adored, maybe not at the moment, and the perception is he will only be the third or fourth choice of their targets over the course of the summer. So it's needs must. So I kind of feel from a fan base point of view,
it's an underwhelming.
Underwhelming and having to work to win them over already, which Ekitike, if he'd gone there, or Šeško, if he'd gone there, they wouldn't have had that same feeling around them.
Well,
I don't think
you'd actually got, Stephen, wouldn't you? You'd felt you've got something that other people want.
Yes.
Now, it's psychology. I'm not, an amateur psychologist, but in life, it feels when you get something that other people want, it somehow validates it more, doesn't it? And if you're talking about a player who's, on the fringes of the squad that he's currently aligned with or he's with, it doesn't feel like you're getting something that other people are coveting.
Yeah, well, I'll look at it in a different way then. So Eddie Howe wasn't number one choice. There was other managers that fell through, and Eddie Howe could have gone, well, I'm only your fourth choice, so I'm not going to really take that. Benjamin Šeško going to Manchester United, it was taught that Gyökeres fell through and he wasn't the number one choice. So what was his choice? Did he go and sign for Manchester United or not because they wanted Gyökeres? I think when you look at signings, there's so many names touted about by agents to make it feel like they're players capable of making a move. Whereas in the background, we don't know whether they're number 1, 2, 3, or 4 down the pecking order. It's a game of roulette at time, or game of sort of putting people in place and using them to get your player a decent move. So when I look at it like that, I think you've just got to accept that you're getting a great move, take it and make the most of it. If Nicholas Jackson goes to Newcastle and scores, 5 goals in his first 10 games, and suddenly Newcastle fans adore him, all that talk about him being third or fourth choice is completely forgotten, and then he's up and running, and he's thinking...
And it won't be the first time that fans have changed their minds, will it? So
no, absolutely not.
Or pundits, Gabby, or pundits.
Yeah. Very true.
What we do have is a certainty that Jacob Ramsey has signed, and Newcastle fans, I think, are very excited about that. And Aston Villa, clearly, John McGinn's comments would say, disappointed to lose a player that's highly valued. So you do feel there that you've got somebody who is an exciting prospect.
Yeah, and I think he's one of these other players that falls victim to PSR, isn't he? I mean, we had Elliot Anderson who left Newcastle because of the same reason. Would he have gone on to play for Newcastle last season? As many games as he did for Nottingham Forest. Again, there's another situation that we look at and say, would it have happened? Would he have played as many minutes at Newcastle had he have stayed there? But he got the move to Nottingham Forest under different circumstances, and now he's got that opportunity to play. I think it's a little bit different with Jacob Ramsey, though, because I think he was one of those players that Unai Emery was very excited about for the future. and also played a lot last season. So this is one of those situations
Well,
where
you make a great comparison there, because Elliot Anderson was one that we were very excited about.
Oh, no,
for the
yeah,
future. But what I mean is the reason he had to go was so that, we can balance the books. It's all about financial fair play. And so that's the same thing that's happening to Aston Villa, isn't it? In a way, with Ramsey. And, and so, and as, some of the comments from the players that have come out in the last 24, 48 hours from Aston Villa would imply that they understand that. Tyrone Ming saying you don't want to hear a bad word or anything negative on his name. You don't know the half of it. I think we do know, don't we?
Yeah, and I think this is the frustrating thing from my point of view when I look at Newcastle, Aston Villa, who've got very rich owners, and I think we've spoke about this many times on different platforms where we're talking about how do you compete in the top six? How do you get to the level of being able to do to go into Champions League football every year? Because we know Newcastle and Aston Villa have got deep pockets, but how can you enable them to get to that position to compete with them top teams? It's not great, and it's not good for the youngsters coming through, and that's a real concern for football in the future.
The stat that has been mentioned a few times with Aston Villa is that their wages to revenue ratio is 96%, which is astonishing, really. Comparison: Arsenal, for example, 53%; West Ham, 58%. It's very early days. Do you have concerns about Villa, who are one of your former clubs? And the only reason I ask that is because Ramsey's gone, Rashford returned, Asensio returned. There is talk that Leon Bailey is on his way to Italy. All of a sudden, from having quite a lot of options in wide areas last year when pushing for Europe and so on, they appear not to have very many now, and they appear to be suffering a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's got to a situation where we're going to see Aston Villa potentially going into the loan market to try and get players. And that's a concern because how long are they going to be there? How much can you rely on those players for a long time? I think Asensio is an interesting one because I know there's talk of him potentially going back on loan to Aston Villa. So I think that would be a good move. Leon Bailey, I think, is if you can get the money for him and sell him, I think that's the right thing to do because I think he's quite inconsistent and he is almost a fringe player. So there are a couple of players that you'd look at and think you do need to shift them on again to get money in, but you've got to make sure you've got replacements.
The other final thing on Villa, there's a great article on The Athletic this morning. I think it might be written by Nick Miller, which is basically saying, Here's an idea, managers. Why don't you try coaching rather than just asking for new players? But he mentions Unai Emery. The starting lineup on Saturday for Villa, 7 of the 11 were there when Emery arrived. It would have been 8 had Martinez not been suspended. So there are 2 things there. One, he is coaching, and that gives them an advantage over quite a lot of them. However, the other stat in the article is they've signed 22 players since Emery was appointed. So they only had 4 in that starting lineup.
So where are they all?
So where are they all? What does that say a little bit about the success, the hit rate of Villa's transfer policy?
Yeah, that is very true. But if you look at someone like Douglas Luiz, again, moved on for PSR reason, you'd like to have him in the team. When Diaby signed, he was one of those players that they were looking at thinking he could be the future of Aston Villa. And I thought he was superb in the first season. At the start of the season, and then he tailed off a little bit towards the end, but that was first season. Then they get a ridiculous offer for him, and again, it's to balance the book. So a lot of it's been taken out of the control, but I do agree there's been a lot of signings that they've made which haven't really hit it off. So that it will have to be looked at. But when you go back to, do I worry about Aston Villa? I don't, because of the manager. I just have full faith in his ability. Tactically, the work on the training ground is quite incredible.
With your Liverpool hat on now, Stephen, do you think we've all been a bit guilty of taking our eyes off Manchester City as being the main protagonist to Liverpool this season? I know it's one result, and I know, that Arsenal definitely were not up to speed, and certainly in terms of, their performance from midfield upwards. Obviously, defence is always rock solid, but have we kind of ignored the fact that City have been doing this rebuild really since January? They kind of wrote off the season, didn't they, very early on, and started thinking about the future. And to quote Joe Hart at the weekend, he said, Pep's just being very ruthless. He's just gone bang, out. I mean, Joe knows all about that. Out, you're gone. And that City are actually perhaps in the driving seat when it comes to pushing Liverpool.
Yeah, I think he's done a lot of a clever business in the summer, but I think a lot of the business that he did in January wasn't the greatest. I mean, if I look at Marmoush, I think, is he a starter, a regular starter for a championship winning team? I don't think he is. Gonzalez, is he an upgrade on or a like for like for Rodri? Probably not. He's not athletic enough in that midfield area. Then you've got Kusanov at the back. Is he good enough to play in that position week in, week out in the Premier League? I think he's more for 2 or 3 years down the line. But when you look at Aitnori, you look at Reijnders, you look at Gyökeres, then you look at those players and you go, yeah, I can understand why you've gone for them. And the great thing is that all these players were good transfer, like good value for money.
Yeah.
They haven't gone out and spent the 100 million that we're used to seeing from Manchester City. So there's been a little bit more thought behind what they've done and trying to keep in keeping with PSR. So it does look better for Manchester City. But again, something that we're going to probably touch on in a few minutes is the Club World Cup. What is the impact that we're going to have from the Club World Cup for both Chelsea and Manchester City? Because we're in that realm of we don't know until it either hits a brick wall or we get to the end of the season and say nothing happened.
We'll do that then, because this is...
It ties in nicely, doesn't it?
It ties in. He's managed to link himself into the plug for his own brand new podcast, which is Strain on the Game, which is all to do with fitness and nutrition and recovery. I am slightly disappointed you didn't ask me to be part of this, Stephen, with all of my
There's still time.
As an elite.
You can do the medical bit because of that thing on your finger, on your pinky, your little finger.
Look, me and Gabby have both got quite serious finger injuries, so we're in this. She's got stitches in one, and I've got my splint. So I hope finger injuries will be a subject.
I don't like to talk about it.
Is that going to be episode 2? Finger injuries in sports, Steve?
Maybe. Well, I've got my guests lined up straight away, haven't I? Yeah.
Go on, tell us about it then.
Yeah, so this was so Adrian Lamb, who work with on the show, is a former fitness coach he worked at Newcastle first off. Then he went to Blackburn, Aston Villa, where I worked with him on a couple of occasions. He also worked at Sunderland, Preston, and then he ended up out in America at Chicago Fire, Toronto, and then he worked for the Chinese national team as their fitness coach. So me and Adrian have kept in touch, and then I went across to America in February, and we met up, went out for a meal, got chatting, and as we do, we just get onto the subject of football, fitness, and things like that. A few too many drinks, and then woke up the next day, and I was like, that would be an interesting side of the game that not many people talk about, and it could be a podcast that we move forward. Sort of getting ideas together and looking at it differently, because I think when we talk about football, we analyse it just from a point of view of what we've seen on the pitch and what's going on and how we can correct it tactically. But we were just looking at the side that people don't often think about, and it is the nutrition side. It is the jet lag or the lack of sleep after games. It is the how do you prepare for a game. So there's so much. Well,
sorry, Stephen. It's also a little bit at this stage as well. Kieran McKenna the other day before Ipswich Southampton in the Championship saying, Chuba Akpom's not quite, he's had a couple of days training, but he's not quite ready yet and I know he's a recent signing for them, but then you're thinking, okay, well, what does not quite ready mean? How is he not ready to maybe be
Gyökeres.
Gyökeres.
Arteta's talked about how he's not quite, his fitness is not quite where he wants it to be, which I found. I kept asking questions at the weekend in the match day green room, hoping for an answer from one of my pundits as to kind of like, how can you not? And Danny Murphy's said, and you might discuss this, Stephen, some players need match fitness more than anything. So they can't get, match fit until they're playing matches effectively, is what he was saying.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's the big thing is understanding what goes on when a player is trying to find a transfer to another club. So a lot of players now, Isak being one of them, because he's obviously in the news so much, is he's not playing games. Now, to get your games in, effectively, you have to think of it like a marathon. You have to build up over time to peak at the right time. Now, peaking at the right time is ideally the first game of the season to come into that. So if you're not peaking at the right time, you're going into that game maybe 50, 60%. So if you think of Gyökeres going to Old Trafford trying to win a game on their first game away from home, if he's at 50, 60% and not quite there, is he worth the gamble on playing him? Or do you go with Havertz and stick with him? Šeško was an interesting one as well. He obviously knew about his move coming to Manchester United, didn't play that much in pre-season. And then you've got the question of, do you start him at home against Arsenal? And Ruben Amorim decided not to. One of the big things that Adrian always talks about, and one of the big things he loves to discuss, is the change in managers in a season. And often you'll hear a manager come in and he will say they're not fit enough for the team. Now,
it's a good excuse though, isn't it, for the manager?
Yeah, but what they're essentially saying is that it's not that they're not fit enough. Every Premier League player is fit to a certain level, but they've got to be fit enough to play that style of football.
That system.
So I think what we saw at the weekend from Manchester United was a manager who's had 6 weeks worth of pre-season, being able to train them the way he wants to train them, getting ready for that. Jurgen Klopp was one of these managers as well. When he first came into Liverpool, they were suffering injuries because they weren't robust enough to train at his intensity and get ready for that level of training. And he said when he came in, they'll work it out and they'll get to that level. And then we saw it after the pre-season, his first full pre-season, is that players get used to that level of intensity, both in training and games. So there's an understanding around fitness as well. And that's something that Adrian's talking about constantly, is that whenever, and we'll see it this year and we'll discuss it in our podcast, there will be a managerial sacking and players and the team will struggle to adapt to either a new system or a new style of play.
Chappers, were you going to say something there?
No. I can't even remember who the managers were, but there was one example where a manager got sacked last season or the season before, and somebody replaced him and went, the players just aren't fit enough. That's what I need to work on. And then the manager that was sacked then got a job somewhere else within about a week. And his first comments were, the players just aren't fit. Well, okay, right. That's how it works.
Very easy to say that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting, isn't it? How individual players as well seem to. I mean, you've seen all the Erling Haaland sprinting up the hill videos. You see Mo Salah in the past has put all of his summer training. I remember last year Wayne Rooney, ahead of a Champions League game at the Etihad, saying that players just need to calm down when they go on holiday, have a holiday, and that, you know, this idea that you train, which would be an interesting conversation to have with Adrian. You know, should players have a total break when they're off, or should they be ticking over? Does their age make a difference?
Yeah, well, that is something that we discussed on our first sort of couple of episodes, which was about the pre-season and what does it look like. And effectively, he wants a period of 2 weeks completely shutting down after the season finishes, whether that's after your last Premier League game or Champions League final, or your international games, which follow the season or the end of the season. And he wants his ideal situation would be to shut players down for 2 weeks, and then you start to integrate the training again, which is not every single day, but probably 3 days a week. And he will give you an individual program where you're working off the back of that. And that is to make sure that essentially you're not losing too much muscle and not shutting down. So Adrian worked with James Milner over the summer. That's one of the players that he's worked with. I bet he's a joy.
I bet he's a joy to work with James Milner. He will do every single thing you tell him, uncomplainingly.
Yeah, but I think James is individually driven anyway to push that. But when they were working out in Spain, and the likes of Jared Branthwaite was there. There was players from other clubs that were there. So this is a new thing where players are realising they can't go back to pre-season overweight. It's not that sort of Ricky Hatton effect where you shut off and you put weight on and you go, right, I'm going back to pre-season and we're just going to run and get fitter. And that was sort of my era, but towards the end of it, and the older I got, and obviously the more experience you got, you thought, I don't want to be throwing up on that first day at training. I want to make sure that I go in better.
When I was a kid and my dad going back to, because pre-season seemed to be, well, the break seemed to be longer anyway back in the 80s and kind of 70s. And I knew business was getting serious when he started putting black bin bags on and going for a run. That was when I knew Seaton was upon us.
I just cut my hair at the start of each season. Makes you look slimmer. There you go. You don't need anything else.
You look fantastic.
Thank you, Stephen. Good luck with the podcast. Strain on the Game, out now wherever you get your podcast. See you soon.
With all the noise that's going on with football and the opening weekend of the season, it's easy to forget there are other sporting events going on. I know we've touched on the Women's Rugby World Cup, and we've got a bonus episode on that later this week. I went to have a chat with the Red Roses, but also at the US Open doubles has been kind of jazzed up, and obviously it's been a lot of attention and coverage on Carlos Alcaraz and Emma Raducanu playing together. That gets underway later today. It's going to be interesting to see what that does. It starts obviously ahead of the main draw, so it'd be interesting to see what that does to the tournament.
You look at it and you think, "God, I'd quite like to watch." Like Raducanu is against Jack Draper that in that mixed doubles tie. So Raducanu alongside Alcaraz, as you said. So you look at the draw and think, "God, I quite fancy watching that. I quite fancy watching that," which is exactly what the organisers want. You know, it's a very Djokovic is involved. It's a very kind of Venus Williams is involved. Very sort of tennis show busy event before the main singles draw takes place. But then what it's also done has meant that lots of players who make their livings out of playing doubles and mixed doubles in particular are losing out on money. And I think that's one of Jamie Murray's points, who is going to join us on Thursday's pod to talk about this. Yeah,
well, let's see whether or not Alcaraz and Raducanu make it through the first round. That's it for today. If you've got a topic you'd like to discuss or a question you want us to answer, then get in touch on email at thesportsagents@global.com or our socials via the link in the episode description.
Catch up with the shows you might have missed on YouTube, Global Player, or wherever you get your pods. Hit subscribe or follow, and we'll see you on Thursday.
The Sports Agents
with Gabby Logan and Mark Chapman.